He walked into the Hargreave estate with a thermos of cold coffee and a 7-year-old girl sitting on his shoulders. That was the part people remembered later. Not the car, not what he did to it. The image of a man in a worn canvas jacket, hands that had never quite come fully clean, no matter how hard he scrubbed, walking through a gate that usually opened for Bentleys and land transfer lawyers. And his daughter up top, her small fingers curled around his forehead, asking if the big house had a dog. He told her probably not. She said that was too bad. That was how Everett Marsh arrived at the Hargreave property on a Thursday morning in early October, when the maples along the drive had gone the color of old embers and the air smelled like the particular kind of cold that comes before the first real snow. He had not planned to be there. 3 days earlier, Everett had been doing what he did most Tuesday afternoons, lying on the concrete floor of his garage in Dunmore, a town of 4,000 people tucked into the river valley east of Calgary, listening to a 1971 Ford Torino Cobra tell him what was wrong with it. The garage was called Marsh & Son, which had been his father's name for it, before his father's hands got too stiff to hold a wrench. Everett had kept the name, even though there was no son. There was just him, and sometimes a part-time kid named Felix, who showed up Saturdays and swept floors and handed him things, and occasionally asked questions that were surprisingly good. The building was nothing impressive. Corrugated steel siding, 2 bays, a waiting room with a coffee maker that ran too hot, and a stack of automotive magazines from 2019. The sign out front had a burned-out letter so it read Marsh Son instead of Marsh & Son, and Everett kept meaning to fix it. He kept meaning to do a lot of things. The Torino belonged to a retired schoolteacher named Bertrand, who'd had it since 1974 and treated it with a devotion that bordered on devotional in the religious sense. Bertrand came by every few months, sat in the waiting room, drinking the overcooked coffee without complaint, and talked to Everett about the car the way some people talked about a complicated old friend, with love and exasperation in equal measure. This visit, the Torino had developed a surging idol, not dramatic, just enough to be wrong. Everett was in the middle of tracing a vacuum leak when his phone rang. He ignored it. It rang again. He ignored that too. The third time, he pulled himself out from under the car and looked at the screen. The number was unfamiliar. Calgary area code, he answered. The voice on the other end was a woman, formal in the way that people who work for other people learn to be formal, not unfriendly, just precise. She introduced herself as the personal assistant to Harlan Hargreave. She said that name the way people say names they've learned to say in a room, where the name carries weight. Everett knew the name. Most people in Alberta knew the name. Harlan Hargreave had built a resource management company from a single equipment lease in 1987 into something that employed 11,000 people across 4 provinces. He was not the kind of man who needed things explained to him. He was the kind of man other people explained things to. The assistant said that Mr. Hargreave had a vehicle that required attention. Everett said he had vehicles that required attention too. There was a pause. She said that Mr. Hargreave had been given Everett's name specifically, that the vehicle in question was a 1969 Ferrari 365 GT 2+2, that 3 separate shops, one of them a certified Ferrari restoration facility in Calgary, had looked at it, and none of them had been willing to commit to a diagnosis, that the car needed to be running by Saturday morning, that Mr. Hargreave had a private automotive exhibition at the estate, invited guests, press, collectors from as far as Vancouver and Toronto. Everett was quiet for a moment. He said Saturday was 2 days away. She said yes. He said he hadn't worked on a Ferrari since his time at a specialty shop in Edmonton, which was 11 years ago. She said Mr. Hargreave understood that. He said he had a 7-year-old daughter and nowhere to leave her on short notice. She said Mr. Hargreave understood that too. There was something about the way she said it. Not impatient, not persuasive, just steady. That made him think she had made a lot of calls like this one and had learned to let the silence do the work. He looked down at the Torino. He said he'd be there in the morning. He told his daughter Bea that evening, while she was eating toast at the kitchen table. Their kitchen was small and always slightly cluttered in a way that felt lived in rather than neglected. Drawings stuck to the fridge with fruit-shaped magnets, a small collection of smooth river stones along the windowsill that Bea had been accumulating since she was 4. The faint smell of motor oil that had long since become part of the architecture of the house. Bia was 7 and precise about things in the way that children sometimes are when they have spent a lot of time with adults. She wanted to know what kind of car it was, he told her. She nodded, as though that meant something to her, which it didn't, but she'd learned that nodding when a grown-up said something technical made the conversation move faster. She asked if she could bring her kit. Her kit was a small red metal toolbox that had belonged to Everett's father. It contained exactly 4 items: a plastic-handled screwdriver that didn't fit anything, a measuring tape, a flashlight that worked intermittently, and a small notebook in which Bia recorded, in her own invented notation system, observations about various things she found interesting. The kit went with her when Everett brought her to the garage on days when school was closed. She kept it under the workbench and sometimes handed him the flashlight when he asked for a light, feeling, he suspected, very useful. He said yes, she could bring the kit. She said good, because she'd already packed it. The Hargreave estate was 40 minutes east of town, up a private road that wound through a stand of old spruce before opening onto grounds that felt deliberate in the way that only serious money could make things feel. Not showy, exactly, but considered. The main house was stone and timber, 2 stories, with a long low wing to the north that turned out to be the carriage house, which had been converted into what Everett could only describe as a private museum. 12 cars, all of them significant. He stood in the entrance of the carriage house and looked at them with the particular quality of attention he'd spent 20 years developing. The kind that didn't announce itself, that looked like just looking, but was actually reading. The 1956 Jaguar XK140 near the window. The 1963 Aston Martin DB4, paint still original and the color of old money. A 250 GTE in the corner that he suspected was worth more than the town of Dunmore. And at the far end, cordoned off from the others with a kind of institutional deference, the 365 GT 2+2. It was a particular shade of dark blue that Ferrari had called Blue Sarah, evening blue. And at this hour of the morning, with the autumn light coming sideways through the high windows, it looked almost black. It was a large car by Ferrari standards of the era, designed for the kind of man who wanted a Ferrari, but also occasionally needed to bring people with him. The coachwork was Pininfarina. The engine was a Colombo V12, which Enzo Ferrari had treated with a reverence that bordered on the religious. Bia stood beside him and looked at the car. She said it was a nice color. He said he thought so too. She asked if it was sick. He said something in it wasn't working right. She nodded, opened her kit, and got out her notebook. Harlan Hargreave appeared shortly after. He was a large man in his late 60s, with the kind of physicality that suggested he had once been an athlete and had settled, gracefully, into something more substantial. He wore a flannel shirt and work trousers, and he shook Everett's hand with the particular grip of a man who still remembered when handshakes meant something. He didn't talk about himself. He talked about the car. That was the thing Everett noticed first. Hargreave had bought the 365 at an estate auction in 2004. The previous owner had been a Montreal businessman who'd kept it garaged through most of the winters and used it sparingly. It had been mechanically sorted when Hargreave acquired it, or so he'd been told. For years it had run well. Last year, a strange intermittency in the ignition system. This spring, at a show in Red Deer, it had simply refused to start. The certified shop in Calgary had kept it for 3 weeks, replaced the distributor, replaced 2 ignition coils, sent it back. It had started fine for the drive home, and then, during a test run the following morning, it had done it again. Misfired badly at low RPM, then smoothed out, then misfired again, then refused to fire at all. Hargreave said it like a man describing a medical symptom. Careful, trying to be accurate. Everett listened without writing anything down. He'd learned early that the notes that mattered went somewhere other than paper. The Calgary shop had said they needed parts from Italy and a minimum 6-week timeline. 2 other shops had declined to touch it at all. One of them had recommended Everett by name, which had surprised Hargreave, because the recommendation had come from a restorer in Vancouver who'd said, simply, that if it was a Colombo V12 and something was genuinely wrong with it, the person to call was the man in Dunmore who'd learned the engine from a retired Fiat engineer in Edmonton and who didn't guess. Everett hadn't known about that reputation. He'd just been doing the work. Bia set herself up at a workbench in the corner of the carriage house. With a cushion from one of the estate's outdoor chairs, her kit open beside her, and a travel mug of hot chocolate that Hargreave's housekeeper had produced with quiet efficiency. She was drawing something in her notebook. Everett checked on her every 40 minutes or so, and she reported each time that she was fine and that she was taking notes. He believed her. He started with what the Calgary shop had already done, not to judge it but to understand the baseline. The new distributor was correct spec. The coils were correct. The plug wires were new and properly routed. On the surface, the ignition system was in order. He spent an hour on the fuel system. The twin Webers had been recently rebuilt. Well, by someone who knew Webers. The float levels were correct. The jets were clean. Fuel delivery looked right. He sat on a stool and looked at the engine for a while. Bea came over around noon and stood beside him. She asked what was wrong with it. He said he didn't know yet. She said that was okay, because sometimes it took a while. He looked at her. She said that was what he told her when she was trying to figure out something hard. He went back to looking at the engine. The thing about a V12, especially a V12 built in the late 1960s, before electronic diagnostics, before any of the systems that modern mechanics leaned on, was that it rewarded patience in a specific way. It was not a forgiving engine. It was not an engine that tolerated approximation. But if you knew it, if you had spent enough time with your hands in its particular geometry, it began to communicate in a language that was less like data and more like character. You learned its tolerances not as numbers but as resistances. You learned where it was generous and where it was not. Everett had first worked on a Colombo V12 at age 24 when a man named Aldo, who had spent 30 years at a Ficat facility in Turin before retiring to Edmonton and opening a small shop, had taken him on as an apprentice. Aldo was not demonstrative. He did not give speeches. He corrected technique by standing beside you until you felt the correction without being told. The thing Everett had learned from Aldo that he carried into every difficult job was this. If the simple things are right and the car still isn't right, the problem is in the thing nobody thought to check, the thing nobody had checked. And Everett did not blame the Calgary shop for this, because it was genuinely counterintuitive, was the timing chain tensioner. The symptoms of a failing hydraulic timing chain tensioner on a Colombo V12 were not consistent. They did not announce themselves the way a bad coil or a lean jet announced themselves. They presented intermittently because the hydraulic pressure in the tensioner varied with oil temperature and oil viscosity and engine RPM, and under certain combinations of those conditions, the chain would develop just enough slack to retard timing slightly but variably. Not enough to throw a code, because there were no codes, not enough to show up in a static timing check, but enough to cause exactly the kind of misfiring and reluctant starting that the 365 had been exhibiting. He found it by process of what Aldo used to call the elimination of the obvious, until what remains, however unlikely, must be examined. The tensioner was not failed. It was on its way to failing, worn to the edge of its service tolerance in a way that only manifested under specific thermal and load conditions. The previous shops had been looking at the ignition system because that was where the symptoms pointed. Everett had looked there too, but he'd also looked at the thing nobody had thought to look at. It was past 9 o'clock in the evening when he confirmed it. Bea had fallen asleep on the cushion at the workbench, her notebook open beside her, the flashlight from her kit still on and pointing at the ceiling. Hargreave's housekeeper had come by twice with food, a sandwich the first time, a bowl of soup the second, and had shown the particular tact of not asking questions or making conversation. Hargreave himself had looked in around 7. He had not asked for a progress report. He had looked at Everett, looked at Bea asleep on the bench, and looked at the car. Then he had said quietly that there was a guest room in the main house whenever they needed it, no obligation, and had left. Everett worked until just after 2 in the morning. The replacement tensioner was not in his truck. He had a workshop manual and his own fabricated gauges and 30 years of understanding the engine, but the part itself he did not have. This was the problem. He had expected to find something addressable on the night. He had not expected it to be a part that required sourcing. He sat on the floor of the carriage house and did the math. The morning was 7 hours away. Parts suppliers in Calgary opened at 7:30. He knew one, a man named Devlin, who ran a specialty import shop in the northeast part of the city and who had on previous occasions located components for Everett that no one else could find and had never once made a production of doing so. It was 2:15. He called Devlin's cell phone. It rang 7 times. Devlin answered. His voice had the texture of a man who had been asleep for 2 hours after a long day, and who was used to calls like this one. Everett told him what he needed. Not more than that. Devlin was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had one in a lot he'd acquired from a shop closure in Kelowna in the spring, and that he hadn't cataloged it yet, so technically it wasn't in inventory, but he knew where it was. Everett said he needed it before 8 in the morning. Devlin said that was going to be difficult. Everett said he understood. Devlin said give him an hour. At 3:30, Devlin called back and said he'd had his nephew drive it out and leave it at a gas station in Strathmore, which was 40 minutes from the Hargreave property. Everett drove out, collected it, drove back. He was in the carriage house again by 4:30. Bia hadn't moved. He worked by the light of the workshop lamps and the particular focus that comes in the hours before dawn, when the world has gone quiet enough that nothing exists except the thing directly in front of you. He knew this quality of attention well. He'd had it since his daughter was born, since the years when sleep was rationed and the garage was the place where everything simplified into just the work, just the problem, just his hands and what they knew how to do. He had learned in those years that grief worked like the tensioner. It didn't always announce itself. It presented intermittently, in conditions you couldn't always predict, and the rest of the time it was just there, worn to a tolerance you had learned to live inside. Marisol had been gone for 4 years. Bia had been 3 when it happened. A cerebral aneurysm, which was the kind of thing that happened to other people until it didn't. Bia did not remember her mother in the way that people remember things they have experienced. She remembered her the way you remember a word in another language that you heard once and never forgot. Something with weight and meaning, but not a full sentence. Everett remembered everything. That was both the thing and the price of the thing. He did not talk about it. Not with Bia, not in a therapeutic way. She had a counselor at school who was good, who Bia liked, and that was enough for now. Not with friends. Because the truth was that after Marisol died, most of the friendships that had existed in their shared life had quietly redistributed themselves. And what Everett had kept was something smaller and more durable. He talked with Bertrand sometimes, because Bertrand was old enough to have outlived people he loved and did not require Everett to explain anything. He talked with Bia about the work, about the cars, about the Riverstones, and why certain ones were smoother than others, and what that meant about where the water had taken them. He talked with the cars too, in the way that mechanics who have been at it long enough always do. Not out loud, mostly, but as a quality of attention that functions like conversation. The 365 GT 2+2 had been trying to tell several different shops the same thing for 2 years. None of them had been listening in exactly the right way. He installed the tensioner. He torqued the components to spec, working with the particular care that the engine's tolerances demanded. He went through the ignition system one more time, not because he expected to find anything, but because the car deserved the thoroughness. He checked the timing. He checked the Weber's synchronization. He replaced the oil, because the old oil had seen enough. At 6:10, he sat back and looked at the engine. Bia appeared at his elbow. She had woken quietly, the way she sometimes did, without announcement. She asked if it was fixed. He said he thought so. She said good. She asked if they could have breakfast soon. He said yes, they could have breakfast soon. He closed the hood. At 7 in the morning, Hargreave came into the carriage house. He was dressed for the day, the same kind of clothes as the day before, not the clothes of a man performing his wealth, just the clothes of a man who owned property and worked on it. He looked at the car. Everett handed him the key. Hargreave looked at the key for a moment. Then he looked at Everett. Everett said he could explain what he'd found, if that was useful. Hargreave said it was. So Everett explained it. The tensioner, the hydraulic pressure variation, why it had presented the way it had, why the previous diagnoses had gone where they went. He explained it without simplifying it, because he had a sense that Hargreave would follow it, and would prefer not to be condescended to. He was right on both counts. Hargreave listened. He asked 2 questions, both of them specific. Everett answered them. Then Hargreave said, would he do the honors? So Everett sat in the Ferrari and turned the key. The V12 started on the first crank. It settled into a low, even idle that was different in quality from any engine sound that modern vehicles produced. a sound that existed at a lower frequency than noise, that you felt in your sternum before you heard it with your ears. 12 cylinders at 1200 RPM, doing what they had been built to do in a small factory in Maranello in 1969, still doing it now, because someone had eventually listened carefully enough to find the one thing that had been quietly wrong. He let it run for 5 minutes. Idle was steady. He brought the revs up twice, slowly, and the engine pulled cleanly through the range without hesitation. He turned it off. He got out. Hargreave had his arms crossed and was looking at the car. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "What do I owe you?" Everett named a number. It was a fair number, not a celebrity number, the number that represented what the work had actually required. Parts, labor at his standard rate, the call to Devlin, the drive to Strathmore. Hargreave looked at him. He said he was going to pay twice that. Everett started to say that wasn't necessary. Hargreave said, "I've had 3 shops tell me what they couldn't do. You came up from Dunmore with your daughter in a truck, found the thing in a night, got the part at 3 in the morning, and you want to charge me a fair rate. I'm going to pay twice that, and you're going to let me." There was not much to say to that. Everett let him. Bea was in the kitchen of the main house by then, eating scrambled eggs that the housekeeper had made, and explaining to her, with great seriousness, the notation system in her notebook. The housekeeper was listening with the full and genuine attention of someone who found the explanation interesting, which was either very kind or authentically true. Everett suspected both. He stood in the doorway and watched his daughter for a moment. She had Marisol's precision. The way she explained things, carefully, in order without skipping steps, was something she had not learned from him. He was not that kind of explainer. He explained by showing. Bea explained by describing systematically the logic of things. He had thought about that sometimes. About which parts of a person get carried forward and which don't. About the river stones on the windowsill and what the water had taken them through before they became smooth. He didn't have a clean answer to any of it. He had the garage and the work, and the Torino he still had to finish for Bertrand, and a 7-year-old who packed her kit the night before a job because she didn't like to be unprepared. That was most of it, really. The exhibition on Saturday drew 43 guests and was covered by a journalist from a Calgary automotive publication who described the 365 GT 2+2 as the centerpiece of the collection and noted that it had recently been returned to perfect working order after an extended mechanical difficulty. The journalist did not know, and the article did not mention, the name of the shop in Dunmore or the man who had worked through the night to get it there. That was fine. Everett was not the kind of person who needed the article. He was the kind of person who drove home on Saturday morning with his daughter asleep in the passenger seat, and the cold coffee from his thermos finally drunk, and the sense, quiet and without ceremony, that the car had been trying to tell someone something for a long time, and he had been patient enough to hear it. Bea woke up somewhere around the Strathmore turnoff and looked out the window at the flat prairie and the particular pale blue of an October sky in Alberta and said, without preamble, that she'd added the car to her notebook. He asked what notation she'd given it. She thought about it for a moment. She said she'd drawn a small star beside it. He asked what a small star meant in her system. She said it meant something that was sick but got better. He drove. The grass on both sides of the highway had gone the color of wheat. A hawk sat on a fence post and watched the truck pass and then returned to its business. Bea fell back asleep. He drove them home.